Who's starting? Am I leading things off or you?
Thought you wanted me to host.
Well, yeah, I want you to host. Yeah, I want you to host. So go ahead. Right.
Okay.
Have you started yet? Good.
Hello and welcome to Juicebox Hero. I'm Bennett Brinkman. I'm NonDoc's education reporter. I'm here to talk to Trace Savage, our editor-in-chief, about where things stand with the budget negotiation process at the state capitol.
Yeah, I'm drinking an apple Simply Nature organic apple juice to get my fluids back in me after several grueling days of public budget negotiations at the Capitol. Bennett's joined me for a few of those. I'm Trace Savage. I'm the editor-in-chief of NonDoc.com. Tara McMillan Hall is behind the camera today helping us record this. We thought that versus trying to summarize all of the nonsense and complicated negotiations that have occurred over the last week, which might change Friday morning, we thought we would record a little video, let people get an idea of where things stand in a sort of revolutionary scenario about how the budget is crafted in the state of Oklahoma by the legislature. For background, session starts the first Monday in February, and this year the state Senate said they were going to try something completely new in terms of ultimate transparency. There's been a lot of hiccups along the way. There's some irony around the word transparency in some ways, and there's a lot of political shenanigans, but the ultimate point of this is that there is a budget portal on okhouse.gov, and then there are copious spreadsheets floating around the state capitol about what each appropriation item is or could be, and over the last week they made a lot of progress.
They have, and to your point about revolutionary, we've gotten to see all of the budget process and the budget negotiations that typically take place behind closed doors. So it's made for some pretty funny moments, I think, at times. For a full recap of all of those moments, go check out Trace's Twitter feed.
At Thrice Savage, it's a little difficult to chronicle all of those into 280 character blurbs, but I've done my best and tried to make it entertaining. So we're going to do the same here. We had juice boxes, so again, we're calling this Juice Box Hero.
Yes.
The legislative sessions.
Yeah, so Trace has been sitting through all these meetings. I've sat through one so far, so I will be asking him questions about what's going on. And to get started, just Trace, if you want to tell us where things stand currently, what have we agreed on? What do we still need to work out agreements on? Right.
So things stand currently that they're going to. This is 4:30 p.m. on Thursday, May 16th, and they are going to return to the Capitol at 9 a.m. on Friday, May 17th, with about 6 or 7 issues still to hash out. They've made a lot of progress on the education sheet. Everywhere you see, as I go through these documents, the yellow things are things that as of 2 o'clock today, they did not have agreement upon, but you can see that on some of these sheets, they have a lot of agreement. In other sheets like this one, yikes, I'm calling that special session yellow, because it certainly implies that if they don't get an agreement done really over this weekend or into early next week, that we could be back for a concurrent special session or some other sort of disastrous scenario. But let's work our way backwards from what happened today. Really, the biggest thing that was agreed to today was there was a question. The Senate, you wrote about this earlier this year, the Senate wanted to do a one-time $100 million funding of support staff raises for staff members at
support staff stipends.
Stipends, I'm sorry, yeah, not raises, stipends, good point. And to that end, the House had some concerns about, well, this is a one-time stipend. Are we going to come back and do this every year? How does that make a big difference? Last year, there was a historic education budget increase. The district should have used that to pay for increased staff salaries. Long story short, there was a global deal that was done today. I say global deal. It was just a multi-pronged deal that was done today. I really need to pull up my Twitter to really articulate it.
I've got,
go ahead.
Not the numbers, but they put, in lieu of the $100 million or $99 million for the support staff stipends, the two chambers agreed to, I think, $25 million into the funding formula. That would be recurring revenue for education that would go towards support staff raises, and some, I think, $27 million-ish for workforce development.
That was through Career Tech.
So
Career Tech funding at $27 million, which was the full ask.
Right, and then a number another amount towards workforce development, and I don't totally remember what that number was.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what it was either, and apparently my Twitter thread wasn't working right. But that's a really big deal, right? 25 million into the formula. Really, there hasn't been much clamoring or request from the education world to increase funding. So compared to prior years where that's really the main thing that's a big question coming out of last year's major raise, there wasn't a whole lot of information on that. And yet, at the end of the day, it looks like there's going to be a $25 million increase. Just as a quick aside, everything I'm saying right now, and the reason we're not writing a full story about it, the reason we're doing this video, which we'll probably delete at some point, is that these issues have not been voted on. They have not been put into a bill yet. The bill has not been posted, and they certainly haven't voted on these things. So it's really, a lot has happened, quote unquote, but until they really get to the finish line, which we don't really know what that looks like, right? Do they stand up and shake hands in a room in public and then come back with the drafted bills? That's really unclear. That's what...
that's kind of what they did with the education stuff last year.
Right, and that's what Pro Tem Treat kind of told you after the meeting today, which was that he expects to have a JCAB, a Joint Committee on Appropriations of Budget, meetings on Monday or Tuesday. If they want to give themselves enough time to override any governor vetoes, they need to get that JCAB running by Tuesday at the latest. Working back from that, the House is committed for the first time this year. I appreciate Speaker McCall saying yes when I asked him this back in October of last year. They've committed to have 24 hours of public review of these JCAB bills before they're voted on. Last year, they revealed them at midnight. I stayed up till 4:30 a.m. trying to read them all, and then they started voting on them at like 9 a.m. the next morning. That certainly wasn't transparent. So the House agreed to do 24 hours this year. The Senate, in a move that summarizes some of the pettiness of some of this, said, no, we'll do 48 hours. And so that's why if they're going to do Tuesday JCAB, they've got to get these bills posted by Sunday, which means they've got to get an agreement either Friday or Saturday. So we could be at the Capitol Saturday. What's your next question, Bennett?
Yeah, one of the big points of contention, I think, still in this budget negotiation process that was talked about today, I don't think there's any agreement on it, is the Legacy Capital Fund. So can you give us just an overview of what that is and what the negotiations are on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Legacy Capital Fund is a really interesting, almost self-financing tool that the legislature created last year. And when I say the legislature created it in 2023, I mean the House and the Senate. It was the idea, not of Chairman Kevin Wallace, although he carried it and pushed it, but of John McFetridge, the House fiscal staff. I published a letter that McFetridge wrote suggesting this as an idea. They put $300 and some million into it, or maybe $600 million into it, used 300 of that immediately, and instead of going to the private bond market and having a state agency like, let's just say, the Department of Environmental Quality, going to the bond market and saying, hey, we need to take out a $20 million loan, $16 million loan to knock down this parking garage that has been condemned and is standing and needs to go away and is unsafe. And we're going to pay 6-7% interest on that, right? Instead of doing that, the state would finance that itself at $16 million, and then DEQ would be obligated to pay that back over 20 years, 1/20th at a time. So the state would actually reclaim that money, keep that money, and then could use it to finance other projects. Senators somewhere along the line have called this a scheme. They don't like it. Treat has said that it has some merit, but they really have not been interested in putting the roughly $350 million of new projects into that this year that Wallace wants in the House. It's really an interesting dynamic at the Capitol because in some ways it's arguably one of the most conservative financial practices that's been passed in a long time, and yet you have a lot of Republicans in the Senate who do not like it, would rather see this either be paid in a lump sum that the agencies don't have to pay back to the General Revenue Fund, or the Legacy Capital Fund, I'm sorry, or they would like to see it go to the bond market and pay 7-8% interest potentially. I'm a little confused why they're so confused. I've heard it described inaccurately several times throughout sessions, so maybe it's a matter of education. Maybe, I don't want to speculate. What I do know is that all these capital projects and this is one of the biggest things that happened today, all these capital projects that have been floating around, the OSBI headquarters, which is apparently mold riddled in at least part of it. They won't tell me how much of it's closed down because of mold, but some amount of it is closed down because of mold, which, parenthesis, if you're watching OSBI, you should tell us how much is closed down because of mold, because you had the building in Lawton where like 7 people got cancer and it was a big disaster and all that. So like maybe be a little more specific about how dangerous of a situation is this for your employees. As an aside, you have a bunch of other projects, a controversial DPS training center in Lincoln County, the phase 2 of that, which doesn't look like it's going anywhere. You've got some projects at Oklahoma State University. You've got a $160 million request from the University of Oklahoma for a new wet lab and for an engineering building. You've got $10 million at Rogers State University in Claremore. All of these sorts of things that are major capital projects. The DEQ parking garage, like I wasn't making that up, right? That's actually a $16 million demo project. It is decommissioned. It is not safe for cars or people, and it's right on the side of the DEQ headquarters downtown. I'm missing a ton of them. If you go down these sheets, there's a ton of things that say Legacy Capital Fund deposit, all this sorts of stuff. The Senate wanted to set a floor on that, a minimum amount that something could be. They didn't want to do 20-year financing on a $1 million project. That makes some sense, right? Don't finance everything like that. The House, for whatever reason, has not wanted to come to a floor on that. They said 5 million, Treat said 20 million, Treat said 18 million, Wallace said 4 million, Treat said you're going the wrong direction. They all laughed, and then they said, how about we just do 0 for legacy capital financing and none of these projects? And Wallace said, sounds good. And so as of now, today, Thursday afternoon, May 6th, there's going to be basically no capital projects, building projects that are done in the state for the next year, except for one. They're going to build an arch out in front of the Capitol. I'll reserve judgment. I don't mean to make any judgment about it, but of all the things that could be discussed, it's fascinating to me that that's the one that's already been signed into law by the governor. So that $4.3 million, which is below the threshold that was sort of proposed by Wallace even, that is going to move forward, but now all these other projects have stalled.
And the arch would be funded through the capital fund?
The Legacy Capital Fund, I believe, according to the legislation that was signed into law. The other thing that happened today, so similarly, think about like hundreds of millions of dollars that they were talking about spending on these projects that they were going to recoup, right? And then just as an aside, the other point of the LCF, the Legacy Capital Fund, is that in a bad budget year, 10 years from now, Bennett, let's say you're the State Department of Education, you get $20 million for a building project, you're paying it back $1 million a year for 20 years, we have a bad budget year, we gotta look at cuts. Well, you know what we can do? We can not have you pay back that $1 million this year, and that avoids a cut that you might have otherwise had to take, right? So that's why some people consider it to be a conservative tool. Again, other people think it's too, they think it's self-dealing, they think it's very weird, they don't like it. I can't speak for either side as to the reasons exactly that they think that, but so that they decided, no, we're not going to do any of those things today. So all the $350 million is off the table. We're not doing any of these capital projects. Could change tomorrow, could change Saturday. I got to think they're going to do something. But the other thing that happened today was there were 2 other big proposals that got essentially zeroed out today. The Senate has been carrying a $125 million request for more water projects at the local level. That was going to go through the Oklahoma Water Resources Board. The Oklahoma Water Resources Board got a lot of ARPA funding last year. They're kind of backed up on some projects. There's a whole issue about DEQ losing money on each of those projects because they actually pay for the engineers, they pay for the licensing, they pay for the inspections, all that sort of stuff. And they're losing some money because they're not collecting the fees, because the OWRB is letting the local municipalities and counties and water districts keep those fees. So Wallace on the House side has some concerns with all of that. On the Senate side, this really was one of the biggest things that they were carrying on their request list. The $100 million stipend one-time deal, that was one of their biggest requests. And then this $125 million for water projects was one of Senator David Bullard's biggest requests. All of a sudden, that looks like it's not moving forward. Yesterday, Wednesday, Wallace said that he wanted the water projects to run through DEQ instead of OWRB. Senate said they weren't ready to deal on that, and then all of a sudden today, now poof, we're at $0 to be appropriated for that stuff. And in addition, in an agreement to go to zero there was also an agreement to do zero for what is called PREP Fund, Progressing Rural Economic Prosperity. That was created in 2022, and that was using a lot of ARPA funding and some other things, and that was to really try to get more sites for industry and commercial development shovel ready around the state. Everybody was talking back then about the potential Panasonic plant at the Mid-America Industrial Park in Pryor, and a lot of lawmakers around the state were saying, well, why are all these projects going to Mid-America? Why would they go to Mid-America? Well, one, they go to Mid-America because they can get affordable electricity from the Grand River Dam Authority, which is the state's power plant, but nonetheless, Mid-America is sort of the main site that Oklahoma has to offer up for these major manufacturing projects and things like that. So PREP 1.0 from 2022 was intended to fund different things at airports, spaceports. They were going to put a gas line out to Burns Flat to try to get the rocket ships into the moon, whatever. And a bunch of other things for PREP projects. I mean, I don't mean to make light of it, like some important projects in rural Oklahoma. So there was a request for another $200, $250, $300 million for PREP funds this year. When they had this moment today where they said, well, we're not going to do any for this, we're not going to do any for that. So now that got zeroed out. So just to put a bow on what happened today, they went back and they said, nope, we're not doing hundreds of millions of dollars of capital projects through Legacy Capital Financing Fund, or really from anywhere at that point. And then, nope, we're not going to do $125 million of water projects. And then, nope, we're not going to do a couple $100 million in Progressing Rural Economic Prosperity funds. So, like right there's dang near $750 million that was maybe going to be allocated that maybe it's not. What does that take us to?
Well, I mean, that would, I think, be an important question for, when things resume at 9 a.m. tomorrow. They've got $700 million more dollars to work with, presumably. Do we know where that could go, or what other big projects they have to negotiate on?
Yeah, I don't know what they're going to do with that. There's a couple things. One, if they do come back to the topic of an income tax cut for $250 million if it's just a straight quarter point reduction, or $300 and some million if they do the flattening of the brackets and the raising standard deduction, that could make that case even stronger for Governor Stitt and for House Speaker Charles McCall, who will be in the room tomorrow at 9 a.m. Wallace will not. McCall really was not in the room Wednesday or Thursday of this week for negotiations, which was interesting. You had Treat, the head of the Senate, on one side against Wallace, the budget chairman, on the House side. So we really don't know. There's also the potentiality that, well, Treat's gone next year, so if he doesn't want to do all these things and he doesn't want to be agreeable on these things, I think if you look, there's more members returning on the House side. McCall will be gone too, but the people who are in the room today, well, what are they going to deal with this guy for if he's out in 3 weeks? Maybe they don't want to allocate that money and they try to do something with it next year. I don't really know. But here's the issues that I have on a checklist that they talked about that they're going to start. They still haven't come to an agreement on a Friday morning. Deferred maintenance issues for higher education universities and colleges. There's a split between 4 years, 2 years, and the Russo schools, which are 4 years, but they're smaller than OU and OSU. Then the deferred maintenance projects also for the State Department of Tourism, the state parks, and then other projects, other buildings and things owned by OMES. Wallace said today there's no doubt there's a lot of deferred maintenance needs. State Rep Mark McBride, Senate Appropriations Budget Chairman Chuck Hall, they have been working on the deferred maintenance. McBride's proposal is to set up a new board, because we're all for smaller government. They're going to set up a new board that is going to have appointees from the House, the Senate, and the governor to determine how much money goes where at the university level. If you just run that all through the state regents, then those are all, I think, gubernatorial appointments. So there'd be a new board for that. And so that's going to be a big question. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars again on the table there. There's a couple of other gubernatorial issues. The governor's quick action closing fund, the House is supportive of $20 million for that. Treat's position is there's already a balance of $37 million currently in the Governor's Quick Action Closing Fund. And similar, though, they did come to an agreement yesterday on $10 million for marketing issues for the state of Oklahoma, probably through tourism, probably through the Lieutenant Governor's office, but $10 million to do more marketing. Imagine that. And then, let's see, we've got a dispute over domestic violence funding. That has been contentious between Treat and McCall for years. I know this video is running a little longer than we anticipated, but this is how complicated this stuff is. This is how much information we wandered back through the Capitol hallways with after all these days of budget negotiations. The domestic violence thing is really interesting. It goes back to pandemic era funding that was going to be given out to the DV shelters and women's shelters around the state, and there was a dispute over the formula that was going to be used. Should everybody get the same amount of money, or should rural districts, rural centers, get a little bit more money because they don't have the ability to raise millions as the metro area does? You can just see where the principals live, right? Charles McCall's in rural Oklahoma in Atoka, Greg Treat's here in Oklahoma City. So that was kind of where that split broke down. That actually blew up an ARPA bill that ended up letting me and Bennett write a story before they allocated $30 million to an interesting grocery store project that didn't happen. And then back on things that we've got to talk about tomorrow, there's still a question about wastewater qualification for the Department of Agriculture for $2 million. The OSDE, they got that $25 million agreement for more money today into the formula, but now there's a question about $4.7 million for assessments. I guess some things have changed with ACTs, Spanish translation. The House seems to really be in favor of that. The Senate wanted to learn a little bit more about that.
Well, and on the assessments question, if these rule proposals go through, the state testing requirements for school districts will be even more important because it could affect district accreditation.
That's interesting.
So they didn't really talk about that today, but I thought that was interesting, talking about more money for testing as it becomes much more important than it currently is.
Yeah, interesting.
Or it could, and those rules haven't been approved yet, but it could.
Yeah, I think the last two things on the list, I'm sure there's more that hasn't quite been discussed. They've been jumping around like a game of pinball up there, which is what I'm doing now, right? So this is how hard it is. Two big things, judicial pay and sheriff pay. Bennett, dealer's choice, which one do you want me to ramble about first?
Let's do sheriff pay.
So there's a proposal from the House. Obviously the Sheriff's Association is in favor of it, but the House has been pushing it to create some sort of stipend grant program administered by OMES that would allow counties to apply for additional funding to support pay raises for sheriffs and sheriff's deputies. The sort of gold star example of why this is needed is Cimarron County, where I think the sheriff makes $29,000 a year, and you can't get any of the very limited CLEAT certified officers to even want to do that, want to take that job, much less people want to be a deputy for a lower level of pay there. So, smaller counties that don't have major tax bases, they have a hard time raising money for increases in salaries for sheriffs and sheriff's deputies. The original proposal was only sheriffs. Then it got brought in $10 million for sheriffs and $10 million for municipal police officers below 4,500 people in the community. That part has been stripped out, and it sounds like they have some sort of potential agreed upon language. The Senate is still a little skeptical, but Speaker Pro Tem Kyle Hilbert on the House side and the Senate Floor Leader Greg McCourtney on the Senate side, they're going to be the leaders of the chambers next year. They're supposed to be working tonight on some language and what that looks like to get an agreement to do some sort of pilot program to try to provide some extra pay for sheriff's offices. The fundamental change there would be that the state currently doesn't pay like operational dollars, salary dollars for county officials like that. Now, maybe that's a good lead in because it is money for district courts. But this would be a fundamental difference. Some people in the Senate are a little bit worried about that. On the other hand, these are both heavily rural caucuses, and the pay is not great for sheriffs around the state of Oklahoma. A certain sheriff in Pittsburgh County, Chris Morris, did get charged with a crime this week, so that probably didn't help things, although I suppose you could make the argument that, he wouldn't have needed to try to get that guy, he wouldn't have needed to sell the $29,000 ATV to the county, if he had a better paycheck. But I don't mean to be flippant, but it is 5 o'clock on Thursday and I'm exhausted.
Yes.
Let's go to judicial pay.
Yes.
What is your understanding of judicial pay? How many times have you read my article?
Not much.
Okay, great. So here's the question on judicial pay. The way judicial pay is set in Oklahoma is there's a board called the Board on Judicial Compensation, and that board meets every other year in October, and they make a recommendation of a pay raise. And this past year, they recommended I think it was a 17% pay raise, and then if that goes into effect, if the legislature takes no action, either to reject it or to modify it, then it automatically goes into effect without the legislature taking any action. It's kind of interesting. I think it's probably a way to depoliticize all of the some of the elements around that, although there's a lot of politics that play around it this year. Because Wallace, the House chairman who I've talked about, he last year was really making a big push to create a new evaluation program by which judges could get some private feedback, have a private entity accumulate information about judges, time that they're spending on cases, feedback from attorneys, people handling cases in front of the court, and that failed in the Senate. It advanced narrowly out of the House. It failed in special session last year in the Senate as a JCAP bill. It had some money with it for training for judges and justices, but since that failed, Treat has been very hesitant to make a deal on this. And so it's very interesting. The Senate's position has been, let's do 6% of the proposed 17% pay raise, which, just to be clear, the Board on Judicial Compensation, they take these things into account. So they know if I want an 8% pay raise, we damn well better present a 16% pay raise because they're going to cut it in half anyway. So as somebody who's been at those meetings, they know what they're doing in that regard. So 17, the Senate said, well, let's do 6. House said maybe we would do 8, but we're not doing anything unless we get the evaluation component. The interesting part on this is the Supreme Court, my understanding, the Chief Justice and other justices, they have come up with new language. They've modeled this over a dozen other states that already do this, and they're in favor of the new judicial evaluation program and the training money that comes along with it, and obviously the pay raise that would come along with it, right? So it's interesting to me that hasn't moved forward. I think last year maybe some district court judges didn't love that. On the other hand, you don't have to open. There was just a judge that was charged with a crime for shooting things up in Garfield County. That sounds ridiculous to say, and it has nothing to do with his behavior on the bench. But there's political dynamics, perception dynamics with that as well. There's a judge in Wallace's district who resigned from the bench in the middle of being removed from the bench because she was texting and sort of making inappropriate, vulgar remarks, scrolling Facebook during trial. She was brand new. So, he has some, interest in that because of how that unfolded in his district.
Right, and I think important to note, too, is that the judicial evaluation bill, as it was worded last year, was exempt from the Open Records Act. So it all stays behind closed doors.
It's supposed to be an internal deal. And what Wallace keeps saying is, how do you keep giving pay raises without having any sort of evaluation component?
Right.
So Bennett, by the way, we're going to have an evaluation component of your job and your hosting skills later this year.
There we go. We can do that as a public meeting. How's that?
Yeah. So I think really that's the gist of it on the judicial pay. Any final questions from you? Anything that we didn't get to ask about as I sip this juice box?
I think that covers most of it. I mean, we talked about how the goal is to try to get all of these things into bills and run through committees by Tuesday at the latest. What are over/under on if we're having these meetings on Saturday?
I think there will probably be some final meeting, maybe press conference, I don't know, Saturday. I think some people have been told to be there. I don't want to really predict it. I think the reality is that they have to be out of the building by May 31st constitutionally, unless they call themselves in a concurrent special session like they did last year, which no one liked and they don't really want to do again. But if they want to give themselves the ability to override any vetoes from the governor, they got to actually send them all the bills by May 24th. So working back from that, we've got about a week for them to do all that. It takes a minimum of 4 days to do JCAP bills, so that's why Tuesday is the day to watch. And then working back from that, the Senate has promised 48 hours of public examination for those bills. So I say all that, that's just the budget. That's just the budget. And once they get a budget agreement, you're going to see all hell break loose with policy bills that are stuck in committee.
I was told today by a senator that when I was asking about different bills that they just don't really know where things stand with some of these policy bills because they're focusing on the budget now. Later is when all the policy bills will come.
Right, and they haven't even named conferees for the conference committee process where there's some House members, some Senate members that get together on something that's controversial. They try to iron out language and they run it back through both chambers. They haven't even assigned who those are for these bills. A lot of really controversial bills still out there. The chicken litter bill that affects liability in how poultry waste is applied on farmland. There's a bunch of things that are controversial and confusing, and it could get really busy, really fast, and have some really late nights over the next 2 weeks. So with that, this has been Juicebox Hero, and thank you for watching our attempt to provide some sort of quick 30-minute summary of the last 5 days of budget negotiations.
Well, cheers to all of your work sitting through hours of budget hearings.
It's great.